In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can use TimeMorpher along with the slope distortion filter in order to create an animation of snow cover on a terrain based on slope. So what we're going to do is create a 4-second animation and take this current scene, which is included with the content examples for snowFlaKe. It's TimeMorpher auto plus slope distortion example setup. Setup is the non-animated version, and the version that is just the example is the completed animated version. So what we have is just procedural terrain with two material layers, grass and rock layer. And we're going to add an additional layer on top of that. It's going to be the snow layer. And then we want to animate its slope or its presence on the material over time to cover the entire terrain. And what we're going to start with is the flatter areas of the terrain and work our way up the steep areas. So if we go to edit the material of the procedural terrain, and I do want to note that I have a keyframe added at 4 seconds for the ground for the position, and that's just to trigger and let view know that we have an animation, because all of this is performed within the function editor, so actual keyframes for the material are not needed. And it does make it a little bit easier to set up. So if we go to the material for the procedural terrain, what we're going to do is add a material layer, and from the landscape group and library, we're going to choose the snow. Click OK. And for alpha boost, we're going to set this to 0, and that way we have no fading. It's going to be a complete overlay. And then just making sure that in the environment tab that everything is set to full range. So the altitude range is -1 to 1, and the slope range is 0 to 180 with no fuzziness options set. So what we want to do is go into the altitude production, so right click, edit the function, and we're going to add in two different nodes. First we're going to add in is going to be a combiner node, MetaNode, and we're going to use TimeMorpher auto. And we're going to use the numeric inputs, and we can just key them in directly. The next thing we want to load in is going to be the slope filter. So under filters, metanodes, we're going to load in slope distortion. Slope distortion is a really cool filter for controlling, based on degrees, the slope influence, along with the ability to input distortion with a degree of distortion defined under the distortion input, and then also a fall off for the top and the bottom. So what we're going to use is the high amount. So if we set that to 0, we see pretty much everything is completely white. Now, because the fall off range is up to 4 degrees, we're going to have a tiny bit of the material showing at the flattest areas of the surface. So if you need to, you can use a negative high value. We need to first go ahead and plug in TimeMorpher and set up our connection here. So we're going to take the top input of the TimeMorpher and connect that to time. And we're going to set our transition time to 4. So 4 seconds is how long it's going to take for our number to go from the start to the end value, which is going to start at 0, which is what we currently have in high, and we want to bring it all the way up to 90 over the time. So over 4 seconds, we want to go from 0 to 90. And now, because of that fall off, if you need to use a negative value, you can set the start to, say, -4. I'm going to go ahead and keep it at 0 because we are going to plug in the distortion point of the slope distortion as well. So what we need to do is extract our high value and connect this to the number output of TimeMorpher. So now, over 4 seconds, we're going to have a transition from 0 to 90 degrees. You can set your transition spline, whether or not you want to ease it in or out or make it linear. If you edit the filter, we can make it linear by turning off the curves option, or we can have a nice ease in and out by turning on curves. So what we're going to do is connect our alpha to the output of the slope distortion, and we already have an animation set up now. But if we want to have an influence of the material itself, in this case what I've pulled out here is the bump. What we want to do is distort our slope influence by this bump, and that's going to add a little more detail to the terrain, especially if you have a terrain that is not procedural, where slope areas don't fall off as quickly or as frequently because there's not a lot of geometry. So it will enhance the overall detail. Now I am using a procedural terrain, so the distortion input is going to add even more detail to that current geometry. What we want to do is take the top of the slope distortion and connect it to what we're using for the bump. What we could also do is connect that directly to the gradient noise instead of connecting it to the combiner, because the combiner is raising it up pretty high, and I want more of a leveled distortion if we take a look at the numeric input. So we can also define the distortion amount. This is a range in degrees, so basically how many degrees do we want distorted by the input. I'm going to go ahead and just set this to 1 degree, so it's not a whole lot of distortion along the slope area. We can keep the fall off at 4 for the top and the bottom. That should be fine. I do have cut lower checked on. That's important because we're just controlling the high amount of slope. We're cutting out the lower portion in order to make sure that no fall off is being used, and we're not subtracting any part of the material. So now this is already set up and ready to go. So we go ahead and click OK. And now over 4 seconds, so that slope is going to change from 0 to 90. So if we take a look at just this render preview here, at frame 0 we don't see the material showing. And then if we scrub through the animation, we're going to see it start to build up. Go ahead and pull that back so we can see as the transition starts to form. I'm going to go ahead and make a quick render preview so we can take a look at the different frames. And this is just going to be 1 or 5 frames per second. The full rendered out version is available with the examples if you want to take a look at the animation for this. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub through, and we'll just see, even though it's only 5 frames a second, you can see the nice transition along the slope. So building on the flat areas and then eventually working its way onto the steeper areas. And like I said, that animation is rendered out and available within the rendered examples for the scene. And if you want to load in the completed version of the scene, you can just load in the example version and not the setup version. But if you want to start at this point and work along with it, then you can load in the setup portion in order to exclude the animated snow material layer.